Hello everyone. Today is August 1st and we are starting the third special class of the course States of Exception in Theory and Practice, organized by me, Professor Antônio Gasparetto Júnior, as part of Global July 2023, promoted by Federal University of Juiz de Fora. I am very glad to receive today Professor Jorge Gonzales Jácome, with the special class Political Ideas and the States of Exception in 20th Century Colombia. Professor Jorge Gonzales Jácome is an assistant professor at the School of Law of the Universidade Los Andes in Bogotá. Professor Jácome, thank you for accepting the invitation and welcome. We are looking forward to listen to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Antonio, and thank you everyone who's joining the class today. I'm very happy to talk to you some of the ideas that I've been thinking about and around the states of exception in Colombia, and I'll be happy to also know a little bit more about Brazil and the history of Brazil. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about Colombia in this class today. So what I was thinking about was I would like to share some ideas with you for the first 45 minutes and then open it to questions or comments. One of the things that I've noticed when we think about states of exception in Latin America or in South America in general is that even though we have different constitutional structures, even though we have different historical trajectories or paths, there are many ideas that we share, there are many legal rules that we share, and maybe I wouldn't say it's a common history, but some things that ring a bell in a way, that are similar from one country to another, and that gives us some clues of how maybe legal and constitutional ideas might have traveled around the continent. Even though we don't have a lot of contacts sometimes, but ideas travel. So I think that would be also interesting to listen about that and maybe how similarities or perhaps differences that we might identify or you might identify from my experience studying Colombia. I've done also some stuff with Argentina and Chile, and maybe not so much in Brazil, but I know a little bit about the context, but it would be great to know a little bit more about that. So Antonio, if you help me with the slideshow, it would be great. So let me talk a little bit about some issues that might connect not only the past. I think I'm more of a legal historian than a constitutional lawyer or a constitutional law professor. I do more legal history. So that's going to be my approach in today's talk, more or less a legal historian. So something interesting happened in Colombia, as it happened in Chile as well, after 2019, and also in Colombia in 2021. So in 2019, 2021, we saw street protests. We saw an uprising, social uprisings. It happened first in Chile, and it also happened afterwards in Colombia. So in Chile, it started with protests around the fees that the Santiago subway was charging the passengers, and it ended up in a more a broader social uprising and I would say revolt, and that it ended up with Boric and most of us know the aborted up to now process of reforming the 1980 constitution in Chile. So it was a process that started with an uprising, but it's still an ongoing conversation that it's taking place in Chile. I don't know if it was inspired, perhaps it was inspired by the Chilean events, but I also think that it had to do with a domestic or local social mobilization that occurred in Colombia starting in 2019. Then the pandemic came, but then in 2021, again, April, May, a new social uprising. So I wanted to start there. I wanted to start in the recent past, but also in the impact that produced in the present in Colombia, and to see how perhaps states of exception were there in that discussions in the social uprisings of 2019 and 2021, and try to understand why did states of exception appear as they appeared in those protests, street protests and streets mobilization and social mobilizations of 2019 and 2021, and then go back in time to understand why did they appear in that way. So let me say a little bit more about how they appeared in 2021, the idea of states of exception and the debate of states of exception, and give you a little bit of context of what was going on in Colombia in 2019 and 2021. So I think that we share with Brazil and also in Colombia, that happens. That's the same case in Colombia. We are countries that always, when we see the Gini index, the idea, the index that tries to measure inequality in our countries, where we don't do very well. So Colombia does not do very well when it comes to inequality. So the distance between those who have a lot and those who don't have much is a huge distance, is a huge gap. So even though the country has showed an increasingly better performance in some of the indices regarding poverty, you still see that inequality is one of the issues that's there for Colombians. So that's one of the things that we have to have in mind when we think about the social mobilization that took place in Colombia in 2019 and then again in 2021. There was this idea of social, economic, and political inequality in the country that a new generation, I think of university students or urban middle classes that have more education, are more aware of that. And then we have a new social uprising in 2019. The second thing that I would like to put on the table to understand what was going on in Colombia in 2019 and 2021 is that Colombia, the government of Colombia and the FARC guerrillas signed a peace agreement in 2016. And well, that changed, at least for the moment, for some moments in time. We can discuss if that's the case right now, but our debate before 2012, when the peace negotiations started between the government and the guerrilla, was more about how to deactivate armed conflict. But when the deactivation of armed conflict with the FARC guerrillas was successful in 2016, then the conversation changed. It was more, to put it in a very, I'm reducing the complexity of the discussion, but to put it in some way, was to talk less about international humanitarian law and the laws of war, and talk more about how are we going to deal with social inclusion. Not that that debate was not there since the 80s and 90s, but it was more evident that if you would open a newspaper in Colombia after the peace negotiation started and after the peace negotiation was signed, so you will see less news about attacks, combats between the armed forces and the guerrillas, and you will start to see more issues about social inclusion. So if you fast forward to 2019, we had a right-wing government that was particularly critical about those peace agreements between the government of Colombia and the FARC guerrillas. But many people saw that those agreements between the government of Colombia and the FARC guerrillas were tremendously important to deactivate armed conflict and produce some measures of social inclusion that would curb in some way inequality. So in 2019, after 1 year of government by Iván Duque, the former president, and the perception that he was not going to implement the peace accords or the peace agreements, people went out to the streets because they also thought and saw that it was important to carry on this social agenda that the peace agreements might have advanced or might have promoted. So in the slide, you see a picture that was in 2021 of one of the uprisings that was really, it became violent, but it was a lot of people. It was not only violent, it was about social inclusion. There were demands about social rights, about labor law, about health, about pensions issue, about education. There were lots of things there in the protests. And of course, there was a lot of there was a moment in which the police forces, which you see there in the picture, were not able to control the uprisings. Especially in 2019, November 2019, there were protests that actually not only in Bogota but also in Cali, the third biggest city of the country, actually got out of control. So people that were participating in those social uprisings blocked the streets. Some people accused those protesters that they were blocking the passage of food, the passage of ambulances. So in Cali, also in some sectors of Bogota, but especially in Cali, there was like this perception that the police forces were not able to control the uprising. And it was not about 1 day or 2 days, but actually it ended up being, they took over the streets during weeks, and there was a perception that the government had lost control of public order. So, of course, one of the issues was that the right wings and also many people from middle to upper classes, but also I wouldn't say that this was only a social class conflict, but actually people from different sectors were seeing with concerns that actually the police forces were not up to the task to control the uprising, and actually the cities were revolving up to chaos. Some people read it, that it was going through that. So the government said that they had to do something about those protests. They had to do something about blocking of streets. They had to do something about constant uprising. And one of the things that they said is like, okay, if the police forces, if this squads that is this police that we call it here, antidisturbios, Escuadrón Móvil Antidisturbios, is not up to the task, well, we might need military assistance. So this was really strange because Colombians had not lived like any moment of military assistance or militarizations of the cities, or at least Bogota or the biggest cities had not been militarized since the 1990s with the war on drugs. And when we were in the drugs against the cartels, it was often that you would see military or military police patrolling the streets. But we had not had that for the last 18 to 20 years. So when the government said, we are going to get out the army and the military forces to gain control of the cities, well, some people clapped their hands, as it always happened with this, and some other people said, like, well, this is something to be concerned, because it has been a long time since the government had not militarized cities. What are the legal powers that allow the government and the presidents to militarize cities? And the president said that there was an article in a law, the Código Nacional de Seguridad y Convivencia Ciudadana, promulgated in 2016. You find in your screen what was the asistencia militar, the military assistance, and what were the powers that he had in military assistance. So many people started to say, oh my God, we hadn't noticed that in 2016, there had been a law enacted by Congress that actually authorized the president or gave the president a legal device that he could use, is that he could send the military force assistance to specific cities when he saw that there was a internal disturbance or any actions that threatened public order. So people started to ask us, okay, this is very interesting and strange, because in Colombia, we had limited states of exception in the Constitution, in the 1991 Constitution. And the story that I will tell a little bit more about it in some minutes, the story is that the 1991 Constitution actually limited the government in the use of states of exception. So this was kind of strange. How is it that a law and not the Constitution actually was authorizing the president to militarize cities when actually the Constitution does not authorize that, and actually that's part of the separation of powers between the government and the legislature? Also, what was weird about this attribution or this power was that what about the domestic authorities, the mayors, the governors of specific provinces or cities? And the question was if they had to authorize that military assistance that actually was a power, apparently was a power by the president. So the debate was like, is there a hidden state of exception in this Article 170 of a law? And actually, the effect of this is trying to circumvent the restrictions that the 1991 Constitution actually stated for the state of exception. So, to sum it all up in this first part, the main question in 2019 and then in 2021 was, is the president or is the Colombian legal order authorizing an exceptional intervention of the military in internal disturbances, actually an intervention that has not been authorized either by the Constitution or statutory laws that are higher laws in the Colombian legal order? How is it that we came up to this, to a state of exception that is not in the Constitution, but is actually in what we call a police code, which is this Código Nacional de Seguridad y Convivencia Ciudadana? So the main question is, how can we analyze this? So my question is, how can we think about this sort of hidden state of exception? How is it that it's not in the Constitution? And how did it become the state of exception that is enshrined in a code that is a law promulgated by Congress, and most of the people were not aware of that attribution or power for the president? So my goal here is to use some tools of legal history to understand why we came to this specific moment. So I would like to say a little bit about legal history, not a lot, but how can you use historiographical ideas to have like some critical project in constitutional law? So what I'm using here is like, there are like different ways of understanding what we can do to constitutional law. How can we analyze constitutional law from a historiographical perspective and bring some critical light to what has happened specifically now in Colombia, but how we can in general use history in a critical way? So what I have here in this slide are 5 possibilities of using or approaching legal history in specific ways that can actually give light to critical projects. So most of these ideas have to do also with some theoretical approaches to law in order to use them when you look at the past. So for example, you can think, first of all, the law conceals a purpose to discriminate, or that powerful classes sometimes fulfill enough promises of the law to convince opposition that the system is capable of being fair. Or you can say that law serves to convince the powerful classes that they are acting fairly when acting according to law. So those 3 ideas about law have a lot to do perhaps with Marxist traditions of how to approach legal systems or law in general. The critical project in historiography and the critical project in law has something to do with Marxist ideas that law is reflecting actually what goes on in class struggle. So in a very, very caricature, to put it in a very caricaturistic way, like a cartoon of what Marxist theories of law want to do or want to analyze, is like they want to say, okay, law is pretty much a reflection of the social domination that the bourgeois or the capitalists have in the system, and actually law is always at their service. So one critical tradition of analyzing legal ideas is like saying, okay, law simply is the reflection of power, of social and economic power. And actually, when you look at law, you have to look of how apparently objective legal provisions, what actually they do is that they're concealing or hiding social and economic interests that favor or are protective or bourgeois and capitalistic systems. That's one tradition. I am not sure that I want to do that. I don't think, in my personal writings and my personal projects, I don't think that law is always realizing the interest of the capitalists, of the bourgeois in a Marxist tradition. But still, what I think that Marxist readings about law bring to the table is something that some people that do theoretical work in law call, and in literature, they call it the hermeneutics of suspicion. What does that mean? It's pretty much that when you read a text, any text that you read, you can take it by face value, meaning that, okay, we are going to have like this idea that what the words mean is actually what the people who wrote those words want to say. But the hermeneutics of the suspicion wants to say, like, okay, every text hides something. There's something behind that text. When we read a constitutional provision of any constitution, it's not only of what they mean, it's not what they mean is not always what they wanted to say, but actually there's some hidden story behind that provision. Behind those words, there's something else. So that's what I want to do. That's what I want to do in my project. And I think that that's what's useful about the Marxist approaches. Sometimes it might be that there are some social or class interests behind the specific legal provisions, but that's not always the case. There are also many types of struggles behind legal texts or legal provisions. So there you find like the fifth the fifth vignette that you find in that in this slide, that laws discourse structure the way in which people perceive social reality and contribute to reproduce the latter. So this is interesting. That's the way in which I approach law, that law is not always at the service of the capitalist class, is not always like the place where you can find social justice, but actually law is a discourse in which you structure what's possible, politically possible, in a specific community. And that's one of the ideas that I would like to share with you about how to read provisions of constitutional exceptions or states of exception. They are discourses, they are words, they are hiding something, not always class struggle. There might be a class struggle hidden. There might be some social domination hidden. But actually, what also happens there is that you have to take the words of the law seriously, because they give us clue of how political ideas are enshrined in law. And political ideas enshrined in constitutional law, that's something that we find obvious, but sometimes we lose sight of that connection between political ideas and constitutional law, especially because when we go to the place of judicial review, for example, a constitutional court, we are complied, or we are compelled to analyze constitutional provisions with some hermeneutic tools that actually what they want to do is like to have a correct legal reasoning to find the solution for a case. But when you use this in a historical perspective with this hermeneutics of suspicion that I would like to defend and to approach the legal phenomena like this, one of the things that I would like to unveil is how the idea or how the provisions of states of exception, what they hide is not class struggle, but what they hide is a very complex political debate of different political ideologies, of different political ideas that are in struggle in our current constitutional systems. So that's what I want to show you with this story in Colombia. So let me start in a conventional place. So now that I said a little bit about what's my approach to legal history, our constitutional history and constitutional historiography, and how to connect law with politics, I would like to start with a very conventional way in which you start debates about states of exception. And maybe the previous classes that you've had have said something about this. I remember when I was starting my PhD dissertation that I wanted to work on constitutional emergencies, that I had two types of reactions. I was working in the United States, so if you might know that the U.S. Constitution doesn't have a specific provision of states of siege or states of exception as we have in the Latin American constitutions or even many European constitutions or laws. The closest things that you find in the U.S. Constitution is the suspension of habeas corpus, but still the exception is a problem that sprang in the U.S. scenario after the 9/11 attacks. So I was doing my dissertation there. I was starting my dissertation. I was looking for supervisors, and one of the things that I had two types of reactions. I was saying I would like to work on states of exception in Latin America, and one of the things that if I would get a liberal scholar would say, there's no thing to research there. the only thing that you have there is that there are provisions that limit the states of exception, and that's it. You have provisions about that. What do you want to say about that? That's regulated by the constitutions. That's one type of reaction. But the other one, and in this one I would like to delve a little bit more, is that, okay, so you want to research about Carl Schmitt. So Carl Schmitt was someone that was in the mind, and it's still in the mind of many of you or many of us when we are thinking about states of exception. I think that the contemporary theoretical work that has all perhaps become also canonical in states of exception is the one of Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. But I would like to stay with Carl Schmitt for a while, who's there in the picture of the slide, and talk a little bit about why I think this is an interesting starting point. But being a starting point is just that, because I do not think that you can tell the story of states of exception in Colombia or in Latin America just by stating the position of Carl Schmitt. I think that Carl Schmitt has something to say for us, but that's not that's just the starting point, but that's not the finishing point. Actually, it says a little bit, but it doesn't say all what we want to say about this. One of his most famous books is Political Theology. Political Theology, I think the first edition is from 1921, then he corrects in 1922, amends some things. And what I find interesting about this book is that Carl Schmitt wrote Political Theology, in which he says some very interesting and important things about states of exception before his affiliation with Nazi Germany. His affiliation with the party would come late in 1933, but actually these texts are 11 years before. So it's just after World War I when the Weimar Republic is starting to be founded. And one of the things I'm saying this because it's so difficult to analyze his texts after he pledges allegiance to the Nazi regime, but if we look at his texts before the Nazi rise, and when he was a young scholar, one of the things that you can capture in his writings is that what he was saying was something that most of the conservative elite in Europe was also concerned about. And here I have there's a very famous phrase in his Political Theology in which he says that sovereignty, he who declares the exception is the sovereign, pretty much. The opening lines of Political Theology, if you allow me to read it, is sovereign is he who decides on the exception. It's a very famous starting point, but I didn't want to share that cliche sentence, but I wanted to share other sentences that come before that striking opening of his Political Theology. And he says, what characterizes an exception is principally unlimited authority, which means the suspension of the entire existing order. So here, there's something complex about this first sentence, because one of the things that we notice when we talk about constitutional exceptions is that the struggle of constitutions in Latin America has been to limit the exception. And actually, what you find in some countries is that there is a very complex relationship between authoritarianism and law, to the extent that when military dictatorships, for instance, stepped into power, one of the things that you would find is that they will also they will try to promulgate some laws, promulgate some sort of constitutional laws in order to say that, okay, I'm acting according to the Constitution. So one interesting example is in the Brazilian dictatorship in 1964, the Acto Institucional, the institutional act of the dictatorship, that has something to do with that. That's copied by the Argentine dictatorship in 1966. Pinochet in 1973, he names a constitutional commission. So it's more difficult than simply saying, okay, they just do away with the legal order and there's no law and there's the suspension of the entire existing order. It's more complex than that in Latin America, at least. But this gives us a clue that the suspension of the legal order is always in play. It's not an absolute suspension. It's not an idea of anomie, the idea that there's no law, but there's some type of regulation there. That's why Schmitt says, in such situation, it is clear that the state remains, whereas law recedes. So this is pretty much the idea that there's a state law, or not even a state law, a state regulation, but law is suspended completely. I don't know if that's the case in Latin America, in which we had like this legalistic culture that tried to keep some part of law in place, even though we had military dictatorships. He says then, every general norm demands a normal, everyday frame of life to which it can be factually applied and which is subjected to its regulations. So one of the things that Schmidt said about sovereignty was that if you can decide that there's a normal situation in which the existing legal order applies, you are the sovereign. But also you can decide that there's no normal situation, and when there is no normal situation, the legal order cannot apply. If there's no normal situation, that's the moment of the exception. If you can decide that a normal social situation is taking place, you are the sovereign, because you are actually going to say that the normality of law is going to apply. What I find interesting about Schmidt's predicament is also a legal theoretical idea that he has. If you place Schmidt side to side with Hans Kelsen, for instance, in his debates in Weimar, one of the ideas, and maybe you have studied Hans Kelsen in law school, one of the ideas is that we associate Hans Kelsen with legal positivism, and the idea that legal positivism, in his ideas, what's the main idea, or sorry, the main, where's the justification and the validity of the legal order? Hans Kelsen would say the first norm, or the validity of the legal order, of the whole legal order, depends on a fundamental law, what he calls the Grundnorm, and the Grundnorm is actually what gives validity to the rest of the law. Schmidt would say that what gave validity to the law was not a rule, a norm, but actually a decision about the norm or the exception. So what gives validity to a legal order? In Kelsen, a norm. In Schmidt, a decision about normality and exception. And this is the existential point of Schmidt. You can never get rid of that. You can never get rid, in a legal system, of a decision about norm or exception. So it doesn't matter if your constitution regulates the state of exception, because always somebody will make a decision of whether a normal situation exists or it doesn't exist. It's not about regulating in positive law. It's about an existential issue of a political community. You always have to decide if there's a normal or exceptional situation. And in that decision, you are the sovereign who decides whether law applies or not. So let's start with our history, with these two ideas in place. One, that we want to find the political ideas behind constitutional provisions. That's one idea. The second idea is that you cannot get rid of the decision of the exception. That's always there. It's like a ghost. Let's work with those ideas and move forward in the Colombian history about the political ideas in states of exception. So I would like to argue that that you can identify, I think, 4 periods to understand how states of exception transformed in the Colombian realm. I would say that there's a moment of corporatism, and corporatism has to do in Colombia with the social question, as it had to do in Brazil. So if you go to, I don't know, Vargas, Estado Novo in Brazil, that's very similar to what I'm trying to argue in Colombia, only that we did not have that charismatic figure of Getulio, perhaps in Colombia, as we had in Argentina or in Brazil, but something similar happened. Then we have the period of the Cold War, that we also have that in Colombia and Brazil. I would think that it's Castelo Branco's coup and his dictatorship between 64 and 84. We don't have that type of dictatorship in Colombia. We have civilian governments, but still, I'm going to argue that there's some militarization of the regime. Then we have a transition to democracy. Of course, the transition of democracy in Brazil after 84, that leads to the 1988 constitution. In Colombia, there's not a transition to democracy in the sense of getting out of a military government, but still, the 1991 constitution in Colombia has to do with some transition to a democratic regime. And then the third period from the mid 90s onward, I would argue that is the period of the deepening of human rights and the strengthening of judicial review of legislation. So those are like the four periods that I would like to say more about those four periods. What I would like to argue is that the political ideas of each of these periods were different, and those transformation of those political ideas actually produce a transformation in the constitutional doctrines of states of exception. Going through these and trying to understand these transformations will give us some clues about what happened in 2019 and 2021 in Colombia, that we had this hidden state of exception in that law. So those are like the periods that I'm going to say a little bit more about that. I found that this picture in this slide was fantastic. It's an old picture of Bogota, I think in the beginning of the 20th century. And the church, of course, is there's the Catholic Church is there. There's like some type of parade, of military parade. And I think that there are civilians watching that military parade. And I think that it says so much, that picture, about the connection between civilian government, religious idea, and militarization. And I think that that's something that has a lot to do with the history of Latin America in general and South America in general. Because in the beginning of the period, you will find like this conservative Catholicism and social Catholicism. Then in the next periods, we'll have this social Catholicism that drifts into the liberation theology. Many characters in Colombia, also in Brazil. Think about Leonardo Boff. And then we have this militarization and this demilitarization. So I think that this picture says a lot about what's going to take place in the 20th century Colombia and also in Latin America. What I would argue is that these periods have some dialogue or some dialectic with the idea of liberal democracy. So what I will argue is that liberal democracy is in crisis in the first years of the 20th century, perhaps also in the Cold War, but then liberal democracy has like some rise in the transitions to democracy of the 1980s. And the question is, where are we now vis-a-vis liberal democracy in Latin America? But I think that that's a way to frame the transformations. So on the one hand, we have like these political transformations, in which I will say more about these periods in the minutes to come. But also, let's start also with the legal provision. And let me explain a little bit more about how were states of exception regulated in the 1886 Constitution that was in place until 1991. Because what I've noticed when I do some comparative work in Latin America is that most of our constitutions had the state of siege enshrined in the constitutions, but the regulations of those states of siege were quite different. And what I've noticed is that that state of siege provision in Colombia was one of the broadest of the whole region. It was very broad. And I think that that has to do because the drafting of the 1886 Constitution, especially this provision, was done by the Conservative Party after they had won a civil war against the Liberal Party in Colombia. So this 1886 Constitution is a constitution that is drafted by the winning part of a civil war, that civil war is going to replicate in the beginning of the 20th century, and they will have to do some amendments. But this provision of states of exception is particularly broad if you consider the rest of the provisions in the rest of the continent. So the provision said pretty much in cases of international war or internal disturbances, the president can declare that public order is altered and thus declare a state of siege in the whole country or in a specific region. This declaration will give the president all the powers conferred by laws and those of jus gentium to defend the rights of the nation. The government will declare the end of a state of siege when the disturbance or external threat ceases. So this was the provision that was in place until 1991. Several characteristics in order to start our history. One of the main features of this provision is that it was a faculty of the president, and the only requirement that he had was that he would get the signature of all his cabinet. And this is not a parliamentary democracy. This is a presidential democracy. So pretty much the cabinet almost all the time sign the decree declaring a state of siege. And he will have to have some, not judgment, but actually some advice of the Council of State, the Consejo de Estado, which was not binding. So the Consejo de Estado could say, okay, it's not good for you to declare a state of siege, which didn't happen. But actually, that was what happened, but that was a possibility, and the president still could declare it. So it was a pretty strong presidential regime in which the president could use the state of siege to declare it and have the faculties that he deemed necessary, all that conferred by laws. Well, there were not much conferred by laws, and we will have some discussion about that in the first period. That will say a little bit more about that. But the second one is about jus gentium, and this is a very interesting term for those who study international law. This was there was the term of using jus gentium when we did not have international humanitarian law. So this is a 19th century provision that used jus gentium in order to think that in international law there was some regulation of armed conflict. So it was about defending the rights of the nation. So we use gentium not as a limit, but actually as a provision that would give some extra permission to the executive. Finally, and last, there was no time limit for states of exception. So the president could declare it for years and years and years. And there was no limit to those states of exception. We have now limits, no more than 90 days, for instance. But back then, we did not have any time limit. So you would have states of exception that would last for 2 or 3 years. And even before the 1991 Constitution, we had a state of siege that had lasted for 7 years. So it was totally a provision that favored the discretionary acts of the presidency. So let's start with our very briefly with the different phases of the state of siege. So in between 1900 and 1960, I would say that the social question is one of the main political lenses through which most of the political elites start to see what happened in most of the West. So the social question, the conflict between capital and labor. For many people, the conflict between capital and labor was disarticulating societies. So the main concern was that the struggle between capital and labor was producing trade unions, was producing revolt, and actually was producing a dissociating effect in society. So this has a lot to do, if you see Getúlio Vargas, if you see Salazar in Portugal, for example, this was the idea that we needed like some nationalism, some national project in order to disarticulate the conflict between capital and labor, and try to harmonize social classes. Peronism in Argentina is also an example. And that also happened in Colombia. This picture that you'll find in the slide is a picture taken one day after populist leader Jorge Gaitan was murdered in the streets of Bogota in 1948. When that murder happened, they say that some historians say that was one of the most violent and remarkable urban riots in the first half of the 20th century all around Latin America. Bogota was pretty much destroyed when the leader was murdered. He was a popular leader. Many people saw him as a possibility of change. And when he was murdered, most of the people from middle to lower classes went out to the streets and actually produced these riots in Bogota that ended up only when the government sent the army. So this rings a bell of what happened in 2021. Declared a state of siege, sent the army into Bogota, and controlled Bogota after the riots of April 9, 1948. The idea was that society was breaking apart. So this is a book of 1955. Gonzalo Canal Ramirez, he's a very interesting character in Colombian history. But when he was writing this book, he was supporting a military dictatorship that wanted to pacify the country. A military dictatorship that was short-lived, that was led by Gustavo Rojas Pinilla in 1953, from 1953 to 1957. And he wrote this book justifying the military dictatorship. So I could say a little bit more about this if you want in the questions and answers, but I'm more interested in what he said and how he understood society. He said, the indispensable element of Christian order is unity, and this unity is broken in all its sociological, social, political, and moral aspect. The specific purpose of authority is broken, which is the common good. The nation is torn apart in a multiplicity of interests. So what these people were seeing is that the conflict, the social question, the social conflict was so delicate that it had produced a permanent state of disturbance, and that the government needed the state of siege powers in order to bring together again a society that was disgregated. So when governments in the 1940s and 50s, and even I think 30s, 40s, and 50s, were going to apply powers of states of exception and will read into the state of siege, the inspiration for them in the use of state of siege was this idea that society was torn apart by the social question. So one of the ideas that they developed was the idea of implicit executive and legislative powers. So what they would say is that, okay, the government has any powers that they deem necessary in order to fix the social fabric that has been torn apart by the social question. So you don't need to have your faculties spelled out in a law, but actually you have implicit powers. Any powers that you deem necessary to fulfill the function that you have to preserve social and public order. So this was pretty much a way in which the governments acquired immense power that led in 1949, for example, to the closure of Congress. So if the president would have any power that it deemed necessary, even legislative powers, what was the use of Congress? So Congress was closed in 1949 and reopened only in 1958 with a democratic and republican restoration that is a very complex moment in Colombian history. That could say a little bit more if you're interested in that. But what I would like to finish this part is to say that the first period, the corporatist period, was the idea of how can we rebuild the social fabric that has been broken by the social question, the conflict between capital and labor, and how we could use states of siege, attributing the president implicit powers, both executive and legislative, to do anything that he could do in order to quell the uprisings. That's why we found the military intervening in Bogota in April 9, 1948 in the picture. That's why we would find implicit powers, legislative powers in which the government would promulgate criminal codes and other type of regulations. Let me go quickly to the second period, a period that was the Cold War and national security. This is something that we are more familiarized in Latin America, I think, because the human rights mobilization memory has said a lot about that, about what happened in our military dictatorships, what happened with the military dictatorship in Argentina, for instance. Now there's this Amazon movie about the trials to the military junta. What happened in Brazil also during those 20 years of military dictatorship, and especially in the Medici period, for instance. Here is a picture of a very famous movie. The movie is called The Battle of Algiers. It is about how the French military take over the government of Algeria in 1957-58 and try to quell the independence movement. And one of the interesting things is that in that movie, this colonel actually that they send to Algeria actually justifies torture and justifies some police procedure and the militarization of the city of Algiers in order to preserve the domination of France in Algeria. I think that one of the interesting things is that he says is that once you are combating not with regular armies, but actually with guerrillas that merge with the civilian population, you need other strategies. That's what he says. And that's interesting because that was pretty much what inspired the doctrine of national security in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. These ideas that left-wing movements and left-wing guerrillas were actually not a regular war, but you needed some type of different war. These guerrilla movements were doing something that was not conventional war. How are you going to combat them? This was the years of what the Doctrine of National Security called the internal enemy. In Brazil, the dictatorship. In Colombia, what's interesting is that there was not a military dictatorship, but if you would stand in the late 1960s and even up to the late 1970s, or even early 1980s, what you find is a gradual militarization of the civil governments. That's something that happened in Uruguay in a way, but in Uruguay, actually, the military came in also in 73, but the Bordaberry government before in the 1970s was very similar to what happened in Colombia, but in Colombia, it lasted. It was civilians in formal control, but actually some clues of militarization with these ideas about the internal enemy, these ideas about that it was not a conventional war, these ideas about a different war that was taking place with guerrilla movements. So if in different countries you had different type of urban guerrillas that were merging with the civilian population, you also found that in Colombia in this period. So in 1978, the government declares a state. In 1976, they declare a state of siege, and in 1978, the government promulgates a very stringent criminal code. It was called the Estatuto de Seguridad. Guerrilla violence was on the rise, and the government says, okay, we cannot control this by ordinary means, and they declare a state of exception. And the Supreme Court had the power in 1978 already to review the declarations of states of siege. And they actually declared the constitutionality of this very stringent criminal code that was giving powers to military commanders and military garrisons and police commanders to actually prosecute civilians for some criminal offenses. And they said this. They said the creation of new criminal offenses and police infractions, as well as redesigning the old ones and the creation of new penalties, is an indisputable power of the government during a state of siege. And here is the justification for this. The rise of new forms of criminality, and what they are thinking about is this guerrillas, urban guerrilla fighting, can precisely be the cause of the disturbance that produces or maintains the state of siege, because such new forms cannot be faced through normal legal means. So what was complicated about this way of thinking about what was going on in society was this, is that if you always have an internal enemy, that internal enemy has the capacity to create new forms of criminality all the time. So law is always in this state of impossibility to cope with the fast pace of new forms of criminality. So ordinary law is never going to be able to cope with that. And in that moment, ordinary law becomes useless. And you will always need a state of exception. So in this way of thinking, you always need new criminal codes, new criminal offenses, new criminal rules in order to deal with criminality. And you will never be able to attack those with ordinary legal procedures. In many countries, for instance, in Brazil, see that you had a long dictatorship, or even in Chile, or also in Argentina, but also that was a phenomenon that was common in some places of Europe. What you had was the normalization of exception. So it was not actually very plausible in how could you end military regimes or states of exception if criminality all the time was new and you needed exceptional regimes all the time. So this led to a period of militarization in Colombia in the 70s, especially, where the Supreme Court actually legalized those types of parallel criminal codes. In the third period, something different happens in Colombia. So what you find in Brazil and other countries is this transition to democracy. But in Colombia, what we had is that it was a period full of tensions, because on the one hand, there was this pressure in the 1980s to make this transition to democracy, to end the militarization of the regime, to open the political game to other parties, and not only the traditional parties, to start peace negotiations with guerrillas. But at the same time, we had the war on drugs in 1984 and the war against the cartels that demanded stringent measures by the government. So these produced lots of tensions, because on the one hand, there was this pressure to democratize that ended up in the 1991 Constitution. But at the same time, you had this new enemy, the drug barons or the drug lords, that you were fighting with states of exception and emergency regimes, something not so different from what has happened in Mexico during the last decade and a half, perhaps. So there you find like some interesting tensions, because you can find both impulses, the impulses to democratize and to limit the state of exception, but at the same time, the impulse to actually preserve the authoritarian measures in order to deal with an enemy, which was the drug barons and the drug cartels. The tension is captured in this picture that you find on your right, which is the seizure of the Supreme Court by a military group, by a guerrilla group, sorry, the M19, the M19, and then how the army entered the Supreme Court with tanks in order to get the guerrilla out of the place. And there was never evidence, but there was always rumors that actually the M19 was paid by the Medellin cartel to take over the Supreme Court, because they were discussing the extradition of drug lords to the United States. So in these pictures, you capture all the tension that's there. So you find the Supreme Court, legality. The Supreme Court is becoming strong in the 1980s, but at the same time, a guerrilla group inside the Supreme Court, they took over the court because they wanted to take the president to trial because he was not fulfilling the peace agreements. But at the same time, rumors of drug lords financing the guerrilla groups, and then the militarized government that actually makes it possible for the military to enter with tanks to the Supreme Court without consideration to the lives of hostages. 111 people died in that seizure in November 1985. So what did that produce in legal discourse, I think? Or how can we think that through legal discourse? Two things happened. Manuel Gaona was a justice of the Supreme Court. He was one of the first generations, I think, that actually was doing their PhD in law in Europe. Actually, I think he studied in France and came back to serve as a justice of the Supreme Court. And he wrote several opinions. And one of the things that he tried to defend was that you needed more limits to the provision of states of siege. And he said that jus gentium, we read it before, is a 19th century expression that has to be brought to the present to include new bodies of law, especially those focused on humanitarianism and the dignity of human beings. Of course, he was thinking in international human rights, whether international human rights could actually be read into the provision of the 1886 Constitution and actually limit the state, limit the government, and say to the government, you cannot do whatever you want with a state of exception because you have the limits of international human rights. He was not successful in court, but he would always bring that to the table in his dissenting opinions. But in 1987, Manuel Gaona, he was murdered in the seizure of the Supreme Court, in the siege of the Supreme Court, in which you find the picture on the right. After this, in 1987, the court declared the unconstitutionality of military trials against civilians. And this was a turning point. So in 1987, this idea that the transition to democracy was bringing more democracy to the floor actually paved the road towards to the idea that the court shares the common concern for the complex situation that affects the Colombian society, guerrillas and drug dealers and drug violence. But the Estado de Derecho, the rule of law, but I think it's more the Estado de Derecho, we can agree on that term that's different from rule of law, lies in delicate and subtle equilibria. And this cannot be lost when we fight against public order disturbances. Actually, using this idea that there were human rights, that there was a transition to democracy, you had to limit the state of siege. But it was a paradoxical move, because when the 1991 Constitution was promulgated, we entered into a new phase. So you would fight judicial review, you will find human rights under the 1991 Constitution, and you had a new provision that actually do new things. They would say like, okay, we'll have a law that would limit the president in times of states of exception, first. Second, there's a limit in humanitarian law and human rights law, what we call the bloque de constitucionalidad, the constitutional block. So international human rights were incorporated. Third, there's a time limit, 90 minutes, I'm in football right now. 19 minutes, no, 19 days for this. So you had limits right now. But still, the court took a while in limiting the state of exception. So what the court would do, and now you had judicial review of the declaration of the state of exception. So if you would go and look at the 1991 Constitution, you say like, okay, so this changed the field. So this changed the field because it restricted the executive to the extent that he now needed to go to court, and the court would have to review whether there was an exceptional situation, whether actually there was an exceptional situation that needed the declaration of a state of exception. So what before was a political power for the president, only he was considering that he was the one in charge of considering whether it was an exceptional situation. Now the Constitutional Court would review not only the measures that he would take, but if there was actually an exceptional event that was exceptional, transitory, that could not be coped with the ordinary attributions. Although the court announced this power, it only used it until 1996. There was a moment in which it's a very dramatic picture on your right, massacres, what we call the massacres in Colombia, that had to do with armed actors, either guerrilla or paramilitary, going into different towns and actually murdering more than 5-10 people of that town because they thought that town was either in the left or either in the right. And it was a very dramatic moment. This picture is from 1994. So the government thought, okay, we're going to declare a state of exception and we're going to try to cope with this problem, deal with this problem with more military, with more aid, etc. And the court said, no, you cannot use the state of exception. Why? Because the court considers that the narrated facts are not the consequence of a specific juncture. They are not transitory or exceptional, and thus can be confronted without exceptional rules. They are long-standing pathologies that deserve a different approach through ordinary mechanisms that the state must use to address functional problems and normal structures. So pretty much what the court said was, you cannot use states of exception only because there's armed conflict in Colombia. We've had armed conflict since the 1960s. So that's not an excuse. That's something structural to our country, and you need to deal with that with ordinary situation, with ordinary legal tools. Actually, the 1991 Constitution was promulgated under fire, and you have the tools with that Constitution and with that ordinary legal order to deal with that, to quell those uprisings. So what was the effect of this decision and some that came afterwards? That the state of interior commotion or the state of exception in Colombia was so difficult to declare. And it has been so difficult to declare. After 1996, there's a state of exception in 2002 when 2 rockets hit the presidential house. And that was the last time that we had a state of exception, of a state of internal commotion for public order reasons. 2002. So 20 years in, we have not used that, because when it comes to the Constitutional Court has strengthened the review to the extent that some presidents find it useless to go to court, because the court most often than not is going to strike this declaration of state of exception down. So I think that gives us an explanation of the first slide that I was presenting to you. Why then do we have a hidden state of exception in Article 170 of an ordinary law, of a Código de Policía? Well, this has to do with the history, that we have a history in which one of the main political problems that we were concerned about was about the state of siege, that political ideas of the state of siege actually broadened the scope of states of exception. And then when the court started to strengthen judicial review, we found that the state of exception was pretty much exceptional, but even more than exceptional, many judged that declaring a state of exception became useless. So what to do then? If we follow Q of Carl Schmitt, that you cannot get rid of the idea of the exception, because you'll always have to decide if there's an ordinary or an exceptional situation. What happens is that if you always have to deal with that decision, and if you limit the president, for example, in the Constitution, the place of the exception is only going to migrate to other places, perhaps less visible places. So let me conclude. Sometimes we have progressive agendas that lead to unwanted consequences. For instance, we wanted to limit states of siege, but once we limit states of siege, they go to other provisions, codes, administrative regulations that actually establish exceptions, but they are less visible than they were in the past in the constitutions. So this leads to a second way of approaching legal issues. One is moralism versus pragmatism, or the idea that should we champion, for example, agendas that are connected with a moral principle, or should we look to the effects that some of our agendas produce in the real world? So this has to do more, do we guide our actions in law by an ethics of principles, or do we deal with an ethics of results? Third, what's the correlation between constitutional law and peace or violence in certain contexts? Because one of the things that happened in the 90s is that when the court became more strict with the control of states of exception, violence in Colombia skyrocketed. Is there a correlation there? How can we analyze that? I'm not sure about it. And finally, was Schmidt right from an existential point of view? Once you can regulate whatever you want, the exception. You can regulate states of exception, but always the idea that there's a moment in which a sovereign must decide whether normalcy exists or not is always going to be present, and it's never going to be able to be limited. Was he right? Or can we have still faith in a Estado de Derecho? Can we have faith in a liberal democracy that would limit correctly the states of exception? Or do we have to concede that point to Carl Schmitt, which is tragic and more pessimistic? So I will stop there, Antonio, and everyone. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions if you find it appropriate.
Thank you so much, Professor Jorge. I would like to say thank you to you for accepting very kindly the invitation for the class today. It was an amazing class to clarify some things that we are talking the last days in our course. And I would like to open this moment now of questions and commentaries, connecting to the last classes that we had last week, especially to the class of Matthias Lenk in our first special class that was last Tuesday, when he presented some aspects of states of exception in the world nowadays. And he skipped the state of siege. So he didn't comment about state of siege. I asked him about it because it was a point of discussion after the class. And as we can see, you mentioned a lot of state of siege in Colombia. And this is my first question to start this moment now that we have after the class. In your opinion, and based on your works, Professor, what is the role of a state of exception to Latin American countries as an important institution of state of exception in our continent?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think that the role of states of exception has actually changed within time. So I think that it has changed during time, but my sense is that in the present, when you think about states of exception, I think that it has pluralized like in two ways. And one of the things that I didn't talk about was economic emergencies, for example. Because that's another aspect of states of exception, is that in case of economic emergencies, when does the president have special powers in order to deal with monetary policy or fiscal policy or whatever, and take some measures like that? So that's another aspect that I think that it has to do also with a history of development economics and the requirements of development, and how do we see our countries. So I guess that economic emergencies, for instance, in the past 60s and 70s, were looked upon as devices that would help governments to deal with moments in which there were economic crises like inflation, etc. So that was something I didn't talk about, and that's also a role of states of exception if we look at from the economic perspective. The second that I would look there is that in countries where armed conflict actually was preserved, and here armed conflict is a tricky category, because we Colombians use it a lot because we have it, I think, still there. Guerrillas that come from the 60s or the 70s, and military paramilitary groups that we associate with the right. So one of the uses of the state of siege had to do with armed conflict. But if we think, for example, of what has happened in El Salvador with Bukele recently, is that the use of a state of exception has to deal with criminality. But when you look at the problem of the maras, one of the instances of social analysis is that you cannot cut ties between the armed conflict in El Salvador in the 80s and 90s, sponsored by the US, right? And how those children of that conflict also became the maras, and even the migrants to the US that are also there. So that states of exception that are right now used as criminality, as criminal, as a way to deal with criminality, always has to do with armed and social conflicts. So for criminal lawyers in Colombia, the idea was that states of exception actually were used to criminalize and to avoid discussing the social issues that were underneath the rise of crime. I think that description is correct for the 1960s and 70s. I don't think that was correct for the 1940s when the social question was there. And the main concern of the people was, okay, what's going on here with the social economic problems? So I think that the second or third use of states of exception is, once you use it, you actually criminalize and try to circumvent the socio-economic discussion when it's about crime. I would say that would be the second use. The third and last, I would say, I think that states of exception are always there. And this, I don't know how evidence. This is more like an intuition, Antonio, I think. Whether the connection or the links that civilian politicians still have with the military in Latin America. And I think that that's like a key or a door or a provision through which you can negotiate temporary presences of the military in government. And it's there. And sometimes you use it or sometimes you not. Sometimes you find that perhaps the military doesn't have a lot of popularity, so you don't use it. But it's there. It's a key in which you can bargain power between the civilians and the military. That's the potentiality that I see in it. I don't know. Yeah, I would say that for the moment.
Okay. One other thing that I would like to provoke you, after all that you demonstrated what happened in Colombia through the years in the 20th century, how do you summarize the states of exception impacts on the development of democracy in Colombia?
That's fascinating. When people sat down to discuss the 1991 Constitution, some of them argue that they were the generation of the state of siege. That's the generation of the Estado de Sitio. They had lived under the state of siege many times. And that generation in the 1990s actually thought that once you got rid of such lenient state of exception, that would be like a positive impact in democratization. That was like what they thought that would happen. I think that if you fast forward 30 years up to the present, and what happens with the state of exception now, like in the sensibility I think of my students that were born in the 2000s. They do not see that the state of exception is such a complicated issue. I mean, when we talk about that in a constitutional law course, they know that the history of the country has a lot to do with a permanent state of seizure exception in the 60s or 70s, but they feel that that's part of the past. And I think that that part of the past has to do a lot with how perhaps provisions that also allow military assistance are not in the Constitution, so they are not that visible. So that's one of the things. So I don't think that today there's a strong correlation between the sensibility of the current generations, that actually there's a problem with states of exception. I think that most of the people think that has been solved, although there's also a discussion about what happened in the pandemic, because there was like a disguised state of exception that was declared back then. But I think that the sensibility is different from the present. If you look into from the present and in the past. In the past, it was there, and they thought, and generations of the past thought that it was necessary to change that in order to produce a democratic scenario. What's the role? So what has happened now? I think that the Constitutional Court has been effective in producing the idea that they are the safeguards, and are the safeguards. They have the safeguard in order to limit the state of exception. But at the same time, and this would be like more important to their question, the question is, okay, if we have states of exception that are reviewed by the court, how is it that we are in a structure of emergencies in which the president and the court have some responsibility in operation? And then when you put the court into that, you end up in this discussion about the counter-majoritarian difficulty. How can courts, if they have this democratic deficit, end up taking this political decision of whether a state of exception exists or not? So that would be like another issue. What has happened in Colombia is that most the cases in which the court has limited the executive have had like some sense of approval by the majority of the people. I don't know what might, and the court in 2002 actually declared the constitutionality of the last state of interior commotion, as we call it for those of public order, conmoción interior, because we had a very popular president. That popularity has not been reached by any president since 2002. But the court has also played politically. So even though you have the judicial safeguards, I think that the approval or not of a state of exception has a lot to do with the popularity of the current president that you are actually controlling in the court. So if you ask me, is there something that the limits of the court has done to improve democracy? I would say yes, but it has been a very pragmatic use in order to do not disturb those presidents that have had popularity.
Right. And finally, Professor, one of the question is, based on what you presented to us too, how do you analyze the state of exception in current laws in Colombia nowadays? And you touched in some moment in this aspect, but the way people feel about state of exception nowadays in Colombia, what's necessary to do about state of exception in Colombia, to change about the laws of state of exception in Colombia, and the impacts nowadays?
Yeah, I think that the recent discussion was in 2021 when as you mentioned, that I touched upon that in the beginning of and actually guided most of my reconstruction. What is the debate right now? If you look at that article that I presented, one of the questions is, for example, if the president has to, in order to declare a military assistance, has to ask permission to the provincial governments in order to send the army. And that's a debate that I think has to take place currently. And that regulation is also there. There has been a debate whether this provision that I presented can or not be declared unconstitutional, and the Constitutional Court said that it cannot be unconstitutional because actually the president is in charge of public order in the whole republic. I think that this provision that's there, I feel like I have mixed feelings about that provision that I presented to you of military assistance, because of course the president has the authority over the armed forces, but at the same time giving it such broad powers in order for him to consider when there's internal disturbance, actually he can send the military, is weird. I think that one of the reforms that must take place is that military assistance has to be dependent on whether there is a formal state of exception approved by the court in order for him to send the military assistance, but not disconnect the constitutional regulation that is already limited with this article that I presented to you. I think that those two things have to be connected because currently they apparently are disconnected.
Thank you, Professor, for the gentle answers. And would you like to comment anything else about the topics?
No, I think that's other than thank you and everyone who's online. Well, thank you for this, and I hope it's useful and gives us. I think I brought more questions than answers, but I think that that's useful as well.
All right. So thank you once again for accepting the invitation very kindly. And I would like to inform everyone that tomorrow we have our fourth and last special class of this course with Professor Maritobon that will talk about states of exception and human rights during the COVID-19 pandemic, uses and abuses. So we'll be together once again tomorrow at the same time, 3 p.m. in Brazil. So thank you, Professor Jorge, once again for being with us today here. And we have one last comment here of our student, Thiago Gomes. Thanks a lot for the class today. That's right. Good afternoon, everyone, and bye-bye.